Sweep the audience. We're using note cards for this evening's presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Our topic for this evening is Cuba. And when I mention Cuba, what comes to mind? The Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs invasion, world-class cigars. It's been nearly 60 years since the end of the revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power in Cuba and ended economic and diplomatic relations with the United States. There has been quite a bit changed over the last few decades. The Soviet Union no longer exists, so Cuba is not really a military threat to the United States anymore. Recently, we have the United States and Cuba has resumed diplomatic relations and reopened the embassies in each other's capitals. And I believe most of what we know or think when we think about Cuba is based on Cold War era propaganda. So what I did was did some research to find out what are the facts today. So let's begin with a little history. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Cuba was discovered by Christopher Columbus on his 1492 voyage to the Americas, and in 1511 the Spanish established the first European settlement on Cuba. And the Spanish ruled Cuba up until 1898. That was the Spanish-American War. That ended colonial rule and ushered in a period of very close relations between the United States and Cuba. In 1920, the U.S. passed prohibition that prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol in the United States. And this really aided Cuban tourism. For instance, tourism grew in Cuba from about 45,000 in 1916 to 90,000 by 1926. Louis Perez, a Cuban historian at the University of North Carolina, said that Havana was then what Las Vegas has become. According to the Smithsonian Online Magazine, by the late 1950s, Cuba was very Americanized. They drove American cars, watched American movies, owned TVs, shopped in American stores. Students learned English in school. They played baseball and they listened to rock and roll. Changes that have happened since the Fidel come to power that has allowed the resumption of diplomatic relations. In 2006, Fidel provisionally ceded power to his brother Raul, and in 2008, Fidel announced that he would no longer seek another term in office. His brother Raul is still president of Cuba. So let's get a few facts and figures about our island neighbor to the south. According to the Central Intelligence Agency's World Factbook, Cuba is roughly 69,000 square miles. It's located, for instance, that's just slightly smaller than the state of Pennsylvania. It's located about 93 miles from Key West, Florida. It's home to 11 million people. And that 11 million people, according to the 2012 census, 64% of them are considered white, about 25% of mixed descent, and 9.3% are considered black. Fox News Latino reports that the monthly income in Cuba is about 421 pesos. That's about 20 US dollars. Doesn't sound like much, but the article also mentions that Cubans don't pay for education or health care, and that many goods are heavily subsidized by the government. According to a poll released in the Washington Post, 97% of Cubans think closer relations with the United States would be a good thing. It also found that most Cubans are dissatisfied with the communist government and their economic system, but they're very satisfied with their health care and education system. For food, I looked to howstuffworks.com, and they said Cubans cook in a Criollo, I hope I pronounced that right, style of cuisine, and those dishes are often spiced with onions or garlic. Other common foods are soups, stews, and sandwiches. For clothing, Cubans wear modern Caribbean-style clothing, not unlike what you might find in South Florida. They also wear Spanish sombreros, baseball hats, and Panama hats. According to roughguides.com, their favorite sports, spectator sports, are baseball, followed by soccer, which they call football, and basketball. The climate there, I went to weatherandtravel.com and found that the average temperatures run lows in the 60s, highs in the 80s. The rainiest months are June through October. The warmest month is August, and the coolest is January. Of course, they're a Caribbean island nation, so they have to deal with hurricane season, which runs June through November. Now that we've learned a bit more about Cuba, let's wrap this thing up. Cuba has had a volatile past, from Spanish rule to their Americanization and then a communist dictatorship. The times are changing, and the two countries have resumed diplomatic relations. While Cuba is not the Cuba of the 1950s, it's not the Cold War era Cuba anymore either. Cubans are not anti-American communist zealots, and of course the poll found that the vast majority of them think that closer relations with the United States is a good thing. So it's probably in all of our best interest to put the past behind us and turn a new page. And I would like to thank all of you for coming. I do have a list of all the resources that was used in this presentation, and you're welcome to a copy of those. Thank you. Hey, we made it! Under 6:30.